Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ModernCyber's first Zero Trust webinar series. This session is going to be about Zero Trust strategy, maturity, and architecture. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And just to do a brief introduction, my name is Jamie Sambauer. I'm a managing principal architect at ModernCyber. Spent over a decade at Cisco on their global security architecture team, but have also held a bunch of roles in other organizations as well. This webinar series is really made to help organizations kind of understand Zero Trust, both from a strategy, maturity, and architecture standpoint, as well as we'll dive deep in our next session on June 22nd around implementing Cisco Zero Trust architecture. And then in July, we'll actually go and follow up with a practitioner's guide to meeting some of the US government Zero Trust requirements. And I know there's a lot of organizations, both in the public sector and a lot of contractors that are looking to be able to meet some of the new Zero Trust requirements. And that's a great session for you as well. Today's agenda, we're going to focus on some of the biggest challenges in cyber, talk through Zero Trust strategy, maturity, and architecture, and then I'm going to give you our top 5 Zero Trust lessons learned. So before we get right into Zero Trust, I always like to take a little bit of time to talk through some of the biggest challenges we're seeing, whether it's Zero Trust related or cybersecurity. And it starts with change. Most organizations struggle nowadays because of the constant change in devices, users, applications, use cases, and really being able to reduce the risk of those new business ventures and applications and users. The other big challenge that we see is data, and I call this the Goldilocks problem. I either, as a security operator, architect, or analyst, have way too much data where I haven't been able to see what's most important or prioritize efforts, or I might not have enough data to make a good, sound decision on whether something's good or bad. To make matters worse, I think most organizations struggle with technical debt. It's something that got set up very rapidly, like an old contractor VPN or some old application or IoT device, and just being able to address providing the appropriate risk minimization and mitigation controls for those legacy devices. Now, I always like to tell kind of a horror story when it comes to ModernCyber, and I like this story a lot. It goes back a couple years where NotPetya, as a ransomware variant, came across a large multinational company. And when you start to think about living in operations and having to deal and respond to threats in real time, imagine in 7 minutes, you're sitting there and NotPetya just spread to every single end user device, including 49,000 laptops, 1,200 apps were inaccessible. Data was on the backups, but a lot of it ended up not being able to be restored. Around 3,500 of their 6,200 servers were destroyed, and all fixed phone lines were inoperable because of the network outage that NotPetya caused. Now, to make matters worse, those mobile devices of operators, security teams, help desks were all synchronized with Outlook, which had been encrypted and wiped. So none of the contacts that people had on their personal phones or business phones actually had contacts within the organization. Now, I don't care how fast you type, I don't care how quickly you get a notification and you try to block a threat, you're not going to be able to respond to this type of threat that quickly. And this is where something like Zero Trust really comes about. Zero Trust can help organizations take a different approach, and it starts for many organizations on the strategy side. Well, what does Zero Trust mean to my organization? And one challenge that we see in many different organizations is we still fight to understand how the different teams might perceive or look at Zero Trust from a strategic point of view. The network team thinks it's microsegmentation. The security team thinks it's next-gen firewall. The identity team is focused on things like multi-factor authentication and single sign-on and ZTNA. The data center cloud team thinks Zero Trust is all about AWS, GCP, and Microsoft Azure. And the DevOps teams, it's in Jenkins. I saw it, like everything's in Jenkins. So that must be the solution. The short answer is that an organization needs to take the time to formalize a definition associated with Zero Trust for your organization. Once you write that formal definition, get the executive support and communicate that definition across your different IT groups and teams. And a good example of a definition taken from NIST 800-207 on Zero Trust architecture. Zero Trust is providing a collection of concepts and ideas designed to minimize uncertainty and enforcing accurate least privilege per request access decisions. And this is a great definition in a broad manner. But sometimes your organization might not want to include least privilege as a requirement as a part of your Zero Trust architecture. So it is something you should take time to formalize. What does Zero Trust actually mean to your organization? And another example of definition is principles. So once you kind of have that definition locked in, you should be defining specific principles that should be met as a part of your design, implementation, and operations groups within your organization. One thing that I always like to say is if we define Zero Trust principles, take ours, for example, we like to talk about removing implicit trust, taking away that basic out of the box, I'm able to get to everything and talk to everything, enforcing risk-based least privilege, and then assuming compromise. If I assume that every user, device, application, and network is compromised as a part of applying Zero Trust principles, now I can take that same mentality and do things like incorporate it into my architectural review board or change control board. Now, if I haven't defined these principles, how do I know how to implement applications or networks in a Zero Trust way? So one of the big strategic tips that we give you is make sure the organization has not only defined formal definition, but has also taken the time to look at what principles you would like to follow. And what you'll find is many of the vendors out there, Cisco, Microsoft, Palo Alto, all have different principles that they will represent. For the most part, you'll find they're very, very similar. So coming up with the right language and being able to communicate those principles so they can be implemented across the organization is a big part of Zero Trust strategy. And just some additional best practices that we found over the many years of doing this, focus on things like what are those top things that if your organization can deliver will make the biggest impact on the overall success of your Zero Trust strategy. Also think about what's not critical to the success. Are you trying to put protection and apply Zero Trust to a mainframe that's going to be gone in 12 months or 16 months? What other items within the organization maybe fall to the bottom of the list? The next big best practice here is around assessing what's difficult or challenging about solving those top things. And what do you need to do to ensure you can overcome those challenges? Are they organizational challenges where one team owns devices, one team owns firewalls, and they don't communicate effectively across the organization? Or could it be a different challenge associated with budget, team capabilities, etc.? And then finally, focus on figuring out what is the logical order for execution as a part of the strategy and making sure that you can set up some steps to make sure that you're going to be successful overall. And I've worked with many organizations, prioritizing their Zero Trust journey. A lot of times it comes down to where they would like to start. Do they need the quick wins? Do they want to leverage what's there today? Or do they want to focus on areas, for example, moving applications to the cloud as a priority area for zero trust adoption, so that they're able to set the line in the sand and say, no more, everything going on in cloud, for example, is going to have zero trust principles and architecture baked in. Now, the other thing that comes up is, well, wait a second, Jamie, what happens, or how do I know where I'm at in adopting zero trust? And that comes down to maturity. And what you'll find, very similarly to definitions and the principles that I was just discussing, in maturity, every vendor kind of has a general maturity guideline. Sometimes it's focused on matching up with their specific products and solutions that they offer. In general, one of the best practices that we've seen over time is using the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model. And just recently, last month, CISA released their 2.0 version of the maturity model. And what this provides is a great framework to evaluate what maturity your organization is at when it comes to the different pillars associated with zero trust. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got identity, device, network, applications, and data. These 5 different pillars then can be evaluated from how effective are my security controls as it relates to zero trust maturity. And just to take one example, if we look at maturity for zero trust for networks, if we look at the optimal spot in the middle, you can see to be optimal, I need to have everything below it, but I should be operating in an environment where I have distributed microperimeters with just in time and just enough access controls with proportionate resilience. Now, some of those terms obviously are a little bit vague. The CISA maturity model does come with a more formal and more detailed list of how an organization might meet those requirements. You'll also see in that box, configurations evolve to meet application profile needs and integrates best practices for cryptographic agility. So these types of things you'll see throughout some of the best practices, but what we're recommending is most organizations need to figure out where they're at today. Are you sitting at a place where within users or identity, you're at an advanced, an initial, or have you made it to that optimal state? And one of the biggest benefits of establishing that baseline of maturity is it can help you look at where does the organization sit today. And this is one example of a maturity mapping that could be performed. So for each of the pillars, we've mapped from 0 to 3, the individual maturity based on current state. And then the goal would be to use that maturity to help prioritize your journey to zero trust. If you're very immature in the device pillar, then maybe that is a focus area that you're going to put more effort, budget, and projects behind to help mature in that area as a priority. And so one of the biggest goals with defining current maturity is it helps set that baseline, create that journey that then helps you evolve to a different level of maturity, and then reassess over time how your maturity's evolved and use it as a great metric spot for tracking your progress. The next thing I did want to introduce a little bit more is zero trust architecture. And one of the challenges that we've seen time and time again when it comes to architecture is this ability for organizations to figure out what technology is actually needed in their architecture to make things work from a zero trust standpoint. And while this survey is from GDIT, it's a market connection survey. They went out and surveyed quite a bit of different individuals in the public sector arena, so both US government and defense organizations. You can see these trends are very similar to what commercial and enterprise organizations have experienced as well. IT professionals find vendor determination more challenging than most of the program managers. Program manager sees the requirement, thinks it's pretty straightforward. When it comes to actually implementing those technologies, most actual practitioners don't actually know, well, what features, what technology, what do I already have, and what should I have to make this work? And then the other two big callouts here are, how much does the organization really have to invest to achieve their target maturity for zero trust? And then the last thing that I always like to mention in a little bit different way than it's written here is lack of internal resources to manage. One of the things that organizations struggle with is, how do I start to address principles like applying risk-based least privilege across my organization without having to add 50 or 100 new security engineers or operators? This is one that most people say, I'm going to do zero trust, but they haven't thought about the operational ramifications of actually doing zero trust and being able to deploy, manage, and operate it. Now, architecturally, one of the best vendor agnostic references you're going to get when it comes to architecture is NIST 800-207. So the NIST standard does call out a more high-level diagram around how a zero trust policy engine should work. And what you'll see here, a couple call-outs, right? We've got our policy information points, which are really those devices on both sides of the diagram that are influencing the policy engine, the policy decision point, and that policy administrator. And what this does is it's bringing in context, it's bringing in risk and vulnerability data and security incident data so that the policy engine itself can establish whether or not something should be allowed or denied based on least privilege principles and based on risk. Now, one of the challenges I've seen practically with organizations trying to implement NIST standard is, well, how many policy decision points do you have as an organization? If you think about the traditional enterprise security stack, you're going to have firewalls. You're going to have an identity system. You're going to have a network that has segmentation and authentication associated with it. You might have a virtualization in a private data center, and you have controls in a public data center. So just off the bat, you can probably think of 10, 20, 30 different policy decision points that have to be able to introduce risk and apply least privilege policy. Now, that's a lot harder than just saying, oh, apply least privilege policy. How do I create the policy? How do I maintain it? The other big question is, how many policy information points and integrations are going to be required to achieve a good picture of context around risk? And then finally, how many different groups within the organization are going to own these different tools, both policy information points like mobile device management, enterprise mobility management tools, vulnerability management tools, and how many different groups are owning the actual policy decision and enforcement points, like the firewalls, like the identity and SSO system. And the bigger question then becomes, how, as an organization, can you operationalize this? So if you've got 10 different teams working in 10 different directions and they're not coordinated, it becomes very, very challenging. Even if an organization only has a single policy decision point for each of the zero trust pillars, you're still looking at an architecture that's going to require a significant number of integrations. So if we've got, for example, network security and network access control and segmentation, that might need to be integrated with your governance, risk, and compliance solution, with your SIM, with threat intelligence, with your patch management, vulnerability management, and a ton of other tools. Now you can see this is a very high level diagram. In practicality, an organization might have 50 or 60 different sources of information. This means that you have to figure out how to integrate and how to build consistent policies, not only within a pillar, but across these pillars as well. Now, NIST does come with some practical advice when it comes to being able to deploy zero trust. And it does start with assessing current systems, users, and business processes, look at risk assessment and policy development, go to deploy, move into operations, and create the feedback loop to make things a little bit simpler. The key thing is start small, gain experience and confidence, and then expand. The challenge with this and practicality is you should have that global architecture. You should have a global North Star of where you're going to go from a policy standpoint and from an architecture standpoint prior to actually starting small and gaining that experience and confidence. Just want to check over my shoulder. If you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat or Q&A panel. I will be looking over my shoulder occasionally. I'm also joined by a few other ModernCyber folks who have been checking for your questions as well. Now, the next section, I wanted to take some time and actually talk through some of the lessons learned that we've had. And as I mentioned, I've been focused around zero trust for almost a decade now. Feels longer, but zero trust is one where many organizations are just looking at what is the practical way to achieve zero trust at scale for them. And so we'll kick off kind of talking through some of the top 5 zero trust lesson learned. Lesson number 1 is starting with visibility. And while this seems very, very easy to say, what I will tell you from experience is most organizations have some form of security or visibility blind spots within the organization. And what happens here is maybe they have a patch management tool that's owned by the desktop team. Security team doesn't have access to that. They don't see that data. So really, it's very difficult to start to come up with the principles, define what zero trust is, and then think about operationalizing policy unless you have the data to do it. It starts by kind of understanding a complete inventory of entities. And broadly, I say entity in a more generic way, because this includes every user, every device, every network device, every application, server, or workload. It also includes things like entities that might be in your public cloud instance. So being able to understand and actually utilize all of the intelligence that the organization has so that you're able to understand that full and complete picture. Once you have that, and actually I'll re-reference knowing every entity, another way of saying that is to map the protect surface. And you'll see that used quite a bit in zero trust deployment methodologies, is to map that protect surface. Once I know every entity, I need to figure out what the communication patterns look like across my organization. Do users, workstations talk to IoT devices directly? Do they only talk to SaaS applications? I need to be able to get a good inventory of all the communication patterns and all the conversations that are occurring. Once I understand that, then I can start to create a baseline. What is normal? What is normal for my organization across the last day, week, month, quarter, or even fiscal year? And once I have this baseline and I can understand what is normal, I can start to create the ability for the organization to be alerted to change and understand as things are happening and changing across the environment. If it's not normal for my organization to send 30 gigs to China, I probably don't want to allow that to occur without somebody getting notified. The final big step for zero trust is understanding how to turn that visibility and that data into policy. And we're going to talk a lot more about that, because this is one of the bigger challenges that I see from most organizations is, well, I've got these tools, they tell me what's going on. I have no idea how to turn that visibility into policy itself. Before we jump into some policy best practices, lesson number 2 is consistency. And when I say consistency, this is something that we find quite frequently, where there might be areas within the organization that has the zero trust principles implemented, and they're working very well for a certain use case or individual area. But one of the goals we should have as an organization trying to implement zero trust is to create the same experience every time. And to me, this means no matter who the user is, no matter what device they're using, no matter where they are, no matter where the application is, we should have consistency in how they do their job. And what does this mean? This means that when I'm in the office or out of the office, I should have the same access to the same types of resources. I shouldn't have to jump through hoops and think about where I'm at, what device I'm on. Based on policy, that consistent policy should be applied ubiquitously, which means everywhere. And what we found for many organizations is they might treat VPN connections differently than users connecting into a formal network via wired or wireless. They might treat administrators differently when they're administrating something in cloud environments versus on-premise. And some of that comes from technical debt, as I talked about earlier, and some of that comes from just having a broad enough view of the architecture to make sure you're applying consistent policy. One example that I like to call upon is device trust standards. This is one that you would think is very simple, but most organizations will have inconsistent policy between how their VPN applies compliance and trust versus how the wired or wireless network might, or their patch management solution does. And so I grew up on the East Coast. We grew up going to state and county fairs and to carnivals. And one of the things you do as a kid is you kind of go and you're able to buy that all-you-can-ride pass. Typically what you'll find is there's 3 or 4 heights within that venue where if you're a certain height, you're able to ride that ride. Many organizations struggle because there's inconsistency in the policy. This could give the same type of framework. So let's say we create a low risk, medium risk, and a high risk device trust policy. And for each of those policies, there would be a consistent set of compliance requirements, whether it's based on patches, what security software is installed, what policies are actually implemented on the machine, and then be able to apply that consistently across your different policy decision points. So if you use, for example, I'm showing some screenshots of Microsoft Endpoint Manager, where within Microsoft Endpoint Manager, I can create different policies around different use cases and groups. Then I can essentially mark devices as compliant or non-compliant, and then I can use that compliance feature and that group feature to enforce device trust standards across multiple use cases. So depending on what your organization has adopted, it could be, well, we use Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we use Meraki Systems Manager, we use Jamf for Macs. Keeping a consistent policy for device trust and then applying that to your VPN connections, wired and wireless, SaaS application access. That way, if I'm, as a user, I'm connecting to Salesforce.com, I know that I need to be on my managed machine with up-to-date policies. If I'm not, it's not going to allow me to access that application until I'm compliant. The same thing goes if I'm accessing an on-premise private application or an IoT device. So by creating these different levels, it also allows the application owners, the data stewards, and the network resource owners to define an easier way of assigning permissions. The example there would be, well, I might have 3 categories, low, medium, and high risk. If you're a low risk device, means you're on a managed machine, it's patched, it doesn't have vulnerabilities on it, it doesn't have indications of compromise. Then I'm going to allow you to get into finance applications, sensitive data or personal identifiable data. But if you're on a personal device that doesn't have security software on it, I'm not going to allow you to get to the sensitive applications or data. So this is a good example of having consistent policy that you can enforce and then articulate out to the end user base. Now, lesson number 3 is one that I always laugh about a little bit, which is least privilege. Least privilege is a term that's used quite frequently, and in reality, it just means to restrict the level of access to a need-to-know level of access. Now, it's very variable in the sense that least privilege for access to a specific URL not incorporated very often. We still use things like URL categories to apply policy to sessions that are accessing the public internet, for example. In firewalls, a lot of times you'll have more broad allow rules. And the real answer is it's not because organizations don't want least privilege, it's because of the focus area and how difficult it can be to adopt least privilege policy across an organization. So in many cases, the focus has been on where should I, as an organization, enforce security policies across things like users, devices, networks, applications, and data. And in reality, you have to really focus on the policy lifecycle management components. And for many people, being able to generate a baseline policy for least privilege access to data, for example, is very painful if you don't have the appropriate tools and you don't have the appropriate staff that has the time to look and inventory that data. Now, once you have a least privilege policy, then the question becomes, how do I maintain the policy? And I like to add on here, not only how do I maintain least privilege, but how do I do it without making all of my end users extremely mad and making the process for them to do their jobs very, very difficult. One thing that does come up is how you start to look at policy creation. And it starts with discovery. So I talked about visibility in lesson number 1. When I say visibility, that is discovering users, devices, applications, networks, and data, being able to baseline the communication and then transition that baseline into policy. Once I'm able to create policy, then I can look at enforcing and monitoring so that I can close the loop and allow, as things change, to automatically update from a policy standpoint. And one area, and I love to give this example because it's generic in nature, is trying to use groups more effectively to create a standard of policy that doesn't have to necessarily change every time there's a change within the environment. So one big challenge is that if you're still looking at making manual changes as new sites come about, as new applications or data center resources move around, then you're always going to be chasing your tail. So by using things like dynamic object groups or security groups as it relates to networking, now I'm able to apply a consistent policy and not require any type of ACL or manual change to occur as something like Bob moves from the campus to another branch. His policy, his rights and resources should remain the same irregardless of location and irregardless of where he's connecting into applications or resources. And same thing goes from a virtual machine standpoint or an application resource standpoint. If the organization decides to move from Salesforce over to HubSpot from a CRM standpoint, even that SaaS application access should be smart enough to allow or notify the administrator to update the policy and allow that new policy to be applied ubiquitously across that network. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about as much is this has a pretty dramatic impact on operations. Isolation and segmentation is a lifetime commitment, especially as it relates to least privilege policy. You need to avoid that firewall and a forget approach that creates the false sense of security. Most organizations have left the available ports, protocols, resources solely based on an organizational need at the time. Doesn't necessarily mean it's least privilege or following those zero trust principles that we talked about a little bit earlier. One of the key things with this isolated or segmented environment is we start to create microperimeters around our high value assets and all assets over time. It becomes difficult or near impossible to meet the current security standards without creating this isolated environment. The key thing is that you need to focus on completeness and consistency across your business processes, your people readiness, and the technical controls. We're going to talk about that in the next lesson a little bit, some tactical tips for you to start to adopt a different mentality and process associated with policy changes. The key thing with isolation and segmentation is when we talk about people, we need to make sure that the stakeholders within the organization understand how connections and policy relate to the current environment and to the future environment. Today, you might have users that are able to access resources that they shouldn't be accessing to do their job. How are you going to make sure that they understand that there is a new policy in place and they're effectively communicated that policy before it's implemented, while it's implemented, or after it's implemented? From a technology standpoint, you have to get better at being able to block unauthorized communications, be able to detect threats, and harden the transit and bridging devices across the environment. This means good encryption. That means having visibility into whether or not the traffic's encrypted. You'll see in the zero trust maturity model that having the appropriate visibility, but also having the appropriate visibility into encrypted communications is a requirement to be in that optimal maturity state. And finally, this is going to come through in process. You're going to have to really dive deep into some of the boring parts, not just the techie, nerdy stuff of configuring things and deploying new products and solutions, but really diving into how you establish, monitor, and update policy and make sure that you revise business processes and technical procedures to map the new least privilege policy model. Which brings us to lesson number 4. And lesson number 4 is all about policy orchestration. And this is one that I find is pretty difficult as it relates to zero trust. Why? Because many people are still doing the same things they've been doing for 20 years. If we look at policy in the old-fashioned way, we've got a user. This user is saying, hey, why can't I get to X? An application, a network, or resource. And we also have a developer. Why isn't my application working? They ask the question, what's the next step that they have to take to actually fix this? They open up a help desk ticket. And I will tell you, 99 times out of 100, we still find this the common, procedure is we get a lot of requests that are happening into operations that are simply, a request to look at why they can't get access to a certain thing, why something's not working. And realistically, it comes down to a human process associated with this. So typically that help desk ticket might get escalated to the firewall administrator or the network administrator. So they can actually look at, well, is this something that should be allowed? Is this something that should be allowed and isn't allowed today? They've got to then take that decision path and then create a enforcement policy so that something new can be allowed or denied depending on policy. The bigger question here is, well, where should this be enforced? Maybe it went to the security guy, he's putting it on the firewall, but really it should have been something that was enforced on the network edge, or it should have been something enforced in the identity system that's out there. The biggest challenge with this old-fashioned way is that it's a bad experience. It's a bad experience for the end user. It's a bad experience for the developer. It's a bad experience for the IT help desk and network or security engineer. No one likes to get that ticket and have to make 400 firewall changes in the next month. That's their job. It just doesn't scale. And the biggest challenge with this is it's also very error prone. What if the person that got assigned the ticket doesn't understand the actual request? What if by allowing external HTTPS access into this developer's app, you're exposing the entire organization to a incident or to compromise? So in this example, it's really how things have been done for a long time. This is without zero trust. Now imagine the process here, and imagine having to move from a very open organization with implicit trust everywhere to applying least privilege access control, meaning everything is isolated, no communication is going to be allowed by default, and every time someone can't get to something, there has to be a new policy change that occurs. This is the reason why we have to look at taking a different approach. And the modern and agile way of solving this problem is to think about, different use cases. Same user, hey, why can't I get my new phone onto the network? Should I be allowed to bring this new phone onto the network? Previously it would have been a help desk ticket. In the new and modern way, we should have those same security analysts, operators, and architects deciding on policy. And they should be thinking about risk tolerance and policy for new devices, new applications, etc. And they should be then applying and influencing that defined policy into something that can be automated from an enforcement standpoint. So in this example, instead of the user having to open up a help desk ticket, the user generally just connects their device to the network. That device can be evaluated to make sure it meets the compliance needs and the risk minimization controls that are in place for automated security analysis. Fancy way of saying, let's make sure it doesn't have vulnerabilities. The patches are up to date. It has, a firewall enabled on it. It's encrypted, et cetera, et cetera. So once that automated security analysis is done, by then evaluating against the corporate compliance or the overarching compliance rules, now I have a policy that then is automated in enforcement. So once the security and other IT teams create that policy with zero trust and least privilege in mind, now anytime that a new user comes in, it falls into that existing use case where we can perform a verification of trust. We can make sure that this is something that falls into the scope of the organization and what should be allowed. And by default, it should be enforced automatically without an end user, without anyone having to take the time to make a manual change. This would leave you in an environment that you don't have to make as many changes, so you can focus on the new use cases, the new business requirements and technical requirements that are coming from different people and groups within the organization. Now, if we flip back to our developer, it's a very similar thing. Hey, I want to deploy my new application. In order to do that, maybe I need external 443 access. Same question should be asked from a security, compliance, and policy standpoint. The difference is instead of making it a manual decision that's made every time someone wants to do this, you formalize it into technology. So we're going to perform automated security analysis. Let's check this application. Does it have vulnerabilities? Is it using middleware that is vulnerable, that's going to bring risk to the organization? From there, what is the policy on allowing inbound access to this new application? Has it been regression test? Has it been through limited availability process? All of the organization's policies then would be built into that pipeline, and the end result is some form of automated access. Now, creating these guardrails and frameworks and being able to orchestrate policy end to end is something that does require an investment and time and energy. So that, I think, is the biggest challenge that organizations find. What you'll see is in that zero trust future, this is a mandatory step. You're not going to be able to configure and deploy policy the way you have for the last 20 years when trying to implement least privilege. You have to take a different approach. It needs to be more agile, and it has to be able to prove out and deal with some of the demands that businesses are requiring. And this is security at the speed of business, right? When a new device comes in, it shouldn't require someone to march it down to a security room where someone manually checks it. Plug it in, it gets evaluated, it gets scanned, it's then determined risk automatically. And then if it falls into the risk tolerance of the organization, it could be allowed. Or if there is someone within the organization that needs to make a judgment call, that process can be automated and sped up to be able to keep things moving at the speed of business. Same thing goes for new applications, new data. Now, we do this using integrations, orchestration tools, and then some of the new cloud technologies really allow us to get even more sophisticated with things like infrastructure as code, policy as code, and then introducing things like continuous integration and continuous deployment across your IT stack, along with things like your application stack. Now, one thing I always like to joke about is old-fashioned is for cocktails, not for cybersecurity. If you're still doing a help desk ticket, having someone have to spend manual review cycles and make a judgment call on whether or not something meets to a formal policy or not, that's pretty old-fashioned. So really think about how to modernize that process and procedure. And for our last best practice and lesson learned is integrations and cross-team collaboration are a must for zero trust success. I go back to my diagram that I drew out to kind of show operationalizing the NIST 800-207. These integrations that you see all provide the appropriate level of information so that a SSO system can do things like device trust checks prior to allowing access to applications. All of these integrations are key to being able to meet a lot of the zero trust principles that we've talked about today and you've seen throughout industry. So one of the biggest questions that organizations have to go through as a part of their zero trust architecture journey is figuring out, well, if I need these integrations to be able to leverage context as a part of policy, do I build the integrations myself, or do I buy solutions that can do the integrations for me? And most organizations probably have a combination. They've built some integrations in a custom format. They're buying some tools and technology to help enable better integrations. But this is something that I find a lot of organizations don't have as a part of their procurement process of new technology. You got to make sure when you're buying that new firewall that it's going to support dynamic access groups, that it's going to be able to bring in context from your GRC system, from your SOAR system or SIM system. If it doesn't, that integration is going to have to be built by your team. So these are the things that are unspoken cost when it comes to total cost of ownership of zero trust that most organizations, they haven't gotten past well, if I buy this widget, I'm closer. Well, only if you've put the effort into deploying it the correct way and integrating it into the correct systems to be able to meet those zero trust principles. And I will give you one example. Obviously done a lot of work on the Cisco front. This is one example of using Cisco components coming with native out-of-the-box integrations to achieve that outcome where Cisco's built those integrations for you. You don't necessarily have to build your own. And so in this case, we've got a solution that contains the Cisco's industrial network, which is supporting things like operating technology environments, power grid, phone or telecommunications equipment, etc. Everything from elevators to power grids is what you'll see with the industrial networks. Now, one of the hard parts about industrial networks is a lot of times the traditional technologies for cyber defense don't necessarily see or understand the protocols in those operating technology environments. So with Cisco solution, they made sure that the industrial network integrates with their Cisco Cyber Vision, which provides visibility into threats, the devices, and CMDB. But not only does that have the intelligence, but it's sharing all of those pieces of context and risk to the firewall, so Cisco firewall in this example, and to the access control solution, which would be Cisco ISE in this example. So every component in this stack is already pre-integrated for you, so you don't have to create custom integrations for every single solution. And this is one example of many. It could be instead of OT for networking and security, it could be identity and SaaS application access or zero trust network access. So integrations are extremely important to be able to be effective and achieve zero trust at scale. Now, I know I have been going for a pretty long time. I want to do a quick summary. So if there's any call to action, make sure if your organization is working through zero trust, have a formal definition and communicate it. Make sure you understand and have documented your current maturity and architecture as it relates to zero trust. You should have a formalized strategy. How is zero trust going to be applied and adopted within the organization? And where is the scope of this? Are you covering every site, every application, every workload? Is some things out of scope? And how does that look for the organization? The last thing is define some journey. Create metrics around maturity and progress so that you are able to track and show progress. This is a journey that I will say has bubbled up to most chief information security officers and sometimes even business boards. How is the organization addressing cybersecurity for the future while things evolve and become quicker as far as deployments are concerned? Well, we're using zero trust, and here's where we're at on our current journey. The last thing I do like to say, think about the lessons learned: visibility, consistency, least privilege, policy orchestration, and integrations are really those top 5 things that I find most organizations aren't focused on enough. They say it, they hear it, but they haven't put the right tools, technology, process, and procedures from a people standpoint in place to be effective at making that happen. Quick call out. So I didn't do an introduction of ModernCyber. Obviously, we're a big cybersecurity solutions integrator. Our focus area is to simplify and accelerate zero trust adoption. One of the resources that I always push customers out there to check out is we have created a zero trust knowledge base. One of the biggest goals was to help organizations understand the differences. How does Microsoft look at zero trust versus Cisco versus Palo Alto? What is strategy, maturity, architecture? So make sure you check that out. It's a great resource. One other thing I do love to say is, especially as it relates to zero trust, we become that Sherpa of your zero trust journey. Vendors provide every tool and capability you could potentially need to be able to achieve zero trust as an outcome. A lot of times it comes with training. It comes with a great partner ecosystem that you can utilize to implement the technology. There are a ton of pitfalls, whether it be deployment or operations, that ModernCyber really focuses on becoming that Sherpa to help you take that journey in a successful manner. One of the biggest things we do is focus on assessments, deployments, and being able to manage zero trust from an end-to-end standpoint. And if you haven't gone through the process of a formal assessment of current maturity and architecture. It is one of the more popular offerings that we do, is help customers kind of define everything. I always like to make the joke, we end up becoming more of a therapist for organizations, helping bring together the different groups and define what the architecture should look like, what the priorities are looking like, and help them come up with that formal documentation around current state, actionable strategy, and getting the organization all aligned around that future. Make sure you check out and register. I know a lot of you on here have registered for some of the follow-on webinars. Tell your friends, make sure everybody knows we're happy to help. And if you have any suggestions on future webinars, feel free to reach out via email or via WebEx or anything else. With that said, I did leave a couple minutes left for questions, comments, or general discussion. Anybody have anything top of mind that we didn't cover that you'd love to hear more about?
I'm not sure I understand.
And Siri wanted to jump in there, but she definitely doesn't have much to offer on Zero Trust today. Let's see. Doesn't look like many questions in the Q&A. Again, I do want to thank everyone for joining us for this first webinar in our series. And definitely reach out to us if you have any questions or if we can be any help in the future. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great day.